And today we are fortunate to have a wonderful group of panelists, which I'll introduce very quickly. The event will be chaired by Steven Spiegel. I'll introduce him in a minute. And we have Dov Weissglas, who is sitting next to him, who is a well-known attorney in Israel and around the world, was the bureau chief from Prime Minister Sharon. And I won't say a lot more because Steve Spiegel will tell you a lot more about his experience. We have next to him Brigadier General Ariel Giladi, who is now in his civilian life the chairman of Western Galilee College, among other activities that he has to promote various types of interactions and business ventures among Israelis and Palestinians. And we have next to him Gaza El-Omari, who is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute, and he was also director of the American Task Force on Palestine. And we have, via modern technology afforded to us by Windows and Skype, we have Robert Danin, who is a senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he will also join us, as you can see, remotely. And one thing that I just want to mention is that in this particular panel, we're really fortunate because our panelists have intimate knowledge and experience with what has happened in Israel during that time, and also specifically with Gaza. And we're fortunate to have as our chair of this event, Steven Spiegel, who is the director of the Center for Middle East Development and professor of political science at UCLA. He's well known around the world for promoting and evaluating various cutting-edge ideas for promoting Middle East regional security and cooperation. He has written a number of books, including The Peace Puzzle, including being a co-author on the book on world politics in a new era. And he is also the editor-in-chief in the Routledge UCLA Center for Middle East Development, which is a series on Middle East security and cooperation, and I can go on and on and on. All I know is that whenever you need to know something about what's going on in the Middle East, Steven Spiegel is the source to go to here at UCLA. So with those words, I'd like to introduce Steve Spiegel, and he will take over.
Thank you very much, Yoram, for those kind words. Welcome, everyone, to this analysis of Gaza 10 years later. 10 years ago, a little over by now, Israel walked out of Gaza, an event that no expert in Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, et cetera, not to mention Cairo or Riyadh, would have ever guessed was possible. No recompense, no payoff. Israel walked out. How did it happen? Why? What was the impact on Palestinians? And how did the highly engaged Americans react? And what does it mean for today? That's the subject on which we will be focusing today. Now, I'm supposed to give these illustrious figures a longer introduction. So I will do so, but as my students know, when we get out of time and we don't have much time, I just start speaking much more quickly. Dov Weissglas, practicing attorney, very famous, and here's what we're really interested in. He was the bureau chief for the Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, and Special Foreign Affairs Advisor to the Prime Minister from May 2002 to June 2006. So during this drama that we're studying, he was the man right there. And of course, he was in an unusual position. He was charged with dealing with the White House, with the State Department, other areas of the U.S. administration, with the EU leadership, heads of major European countries, several Arab countries, et cetera, et cetera. That's the shortest bio I was given. Brigadier General in Reserve Eval Giladi is today chairman of Western Galilee College, which is a remarkable achievement. We don't have time to talk about it, though. He's the president of the Israeli-Palestine Chamber of Commerce, of which he was co-founder, founder and CEO of the Portland Trust in Israel, which is a British foundation committed to peace. And he, during this time that we're focusing on, he was appointed head of coordination and strategy at the Office of the Prime Minister in March 2005. But from 2001 to 2004, he served as head of the Israel Defense Forces Strategic Planning Division, and he had basically responsibility for Israel leaving Gaza. So here we have the two key Israeli players on the ground. Now, what effect did this have on the Palestinians? For this, we have Raith Alamari, who is today a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's a former executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine. Prior to that, he served in various positions within the Palestinian Authority, including director of the International Relations Department of the Office of the Palestinian President and advisor to former Palestinian Authority President,
Prime Minister.
Yes, that's a mistake. Prime Minister, now President, of course, Mahmoud Abbas. Now, he was giving advice on foreign policy, and he was also there on the scene. Raith has all sorts of credits and involvement. We don't have time for that. Rob Dineen. Now, let me say something about Rob Dineen. Rob Dineen, who could not make it here to California because it's only so much time, was going to be and is the great experiment in the new UCLA Zoom technology. And Rob, you can see his face. I'll introduce him in a moment, but I can say that this technology has not completely succeeded, and therefore there's a poor assistant who is crouched trying to make the microphone. Can you hear us, Rob?
I hear you fine.
Amazing. But the computer didn't work totally. And so like the UCLA football team last Saturday, it has not completely performed. Rob Dineen is a senior fellow today for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center for Middle East Initiative. He has headed the Jerusalem mission of the Quartet representative Tony Blair from April 2008 until August 2010. He's a former career State Department official with over 20 years of Middle East experience. He's also worked in, particularly during the Bush years, when all of this was happening, he was in the National Security Council. So on the Washington side, on the American side, Rob was also there. That's all I'm going to say. Let's get to our speakers. They have a lot more to say. And let's start with Dov Weissglas.
The question which is being raised time and again whenever we tackle this subject is what made Sharon, Ariel Sharon, founder of the Likud, I think the crown leader of Israel radical right, the master settler in Gaza and the West Bank, as he always proudly stated, that there is no single home in Judea and Samaria that he didn't fix the mezuzah there, which was right, which was almost right. What happened that towards the end of his tenure, he decided to leave Gaza, which was the first, unfortunately, it seems to be the last move that Israel has done in order to accomplish a political resolution with the Palestinians. I'm not sure that our distinguished moderator will allow us the time to explain in depth the process that he's gone through, but I'll try to do it within this very cruel time limitations that imposed on us. by the way, as a general remark, you have to understand, in Israel, the future is certain and well known. It's always the past that keeps changing. And since we deal with a matter which belongs to our past, many opinions, I mean, there's many Israelis it's the number of opinions about it. But I'll try to stick what happened in few words is, and once Sharon said it very well, he said, what you see from here, and what he meant, what you see from the Prime Minister's desk, you don't see from elsewhere. And I think he realized in a pretty sad process that nobody in the world, not even in Israel, agrees with Israel's territorial claims over Gaza or the West Bank. What he realized, and again, in a process that cooked into him very slowly, that what we always believed, and say I think that Israel, I was born in Israel, and I'm old enough, to experience what happened in 56, in 67, in 73, but mainly in 67. The 67 war ended, the general feeling in Israel was that this is just a justified historic correction of the 48 boundaries. What we consider the 48 boundaries as a territorial or topographical or geopolitical outcome which is simply unbearable, impossible, as once Abba Ibn defined it as Auschwitz boundaries. And what happened in 67 is the necessary correction of those boundaries. But then he realized that other than ourselves, and not even all of us, nobody agrees. Once it happened, it was clear that our presence in these areas must come to an end. He also realized, and again in a sort of a very slow, long process, that if we will not initiate a territorial solution, if it will not we that will lead a process that will end up with formulation of an agreed boundaries, it will be imposed on us. And this is exactly what's happening today, by the way. He believed that if, as I said, if we will take the initiative and we will shape the map by ourselves, we will save, if I may use the word, about 180,000 settlers out of 225,000. That was the number now. When the number today is almost and doubled. And once we understood that our presence in these areas must come to an end, Gaza became almost a natural place just to get out of there. Gaza, which is one of the poorest, most dense, underprivileged parts of the world, at that time with average income per family on a monthly basis of $80. Now it's a little bit more, with 45% of unemployment, with over 75% of Palestinians in Gaza who live wholly or partially on an international support, like the United Nations Refugees Relief Agency, Red Cross, American Aid, etc. And 7,000 Israeli settlers scattered in 17 little settlements, occupying 1/3 of the area of Gaza, and the other 2/3 are shared by almost 2 million people. We realized that a kind of life that when a kid gets a toothache at 3 o'clock in the morning in one of these settlements, so the parents calls the local commander. And the next step, you see a motorcade of 2 APCs, two armed vehicles, with two classes of soldiers, a tank in the front, a tank in the back. In days of severe tension, and helicopter goes back and forth. And this entire armade, in the middle, you see this little Fiat Punto, it calls it. It's a car big like this, with the mother behind the wheel and a screaming kid. And this whole motorcade is on its way to Ashkelon. And then, thanks God, the truth is pulled out, and happily they come back. He understood that these realities cannot last, because we will not be allowed to keep them that way. So Gaza, as I said, was the first in a line of further similar action that was supposed to be done in the future, but then there was certain, to me, very unexplained intervention of Almighty that brought his career into its end on January 2006. Of course, what's happening now on our southern border with Hamas in Gaza, the missiles, the shooting, and all these miseries are attributed very unrightly to the disengagement of Gaza. So it's an opportunity to correct some historical facts. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, left Gaza on July 94, 11 years before then. Just to remind everybody that part of the Oslo Pact was Gaza and Jericho first. It was the agreement that the first two Palestinian areas that the IDF will leave was Gaza, and then the IDF, and my good friend Ariel will confirm it, happily run out of Gaza, which militarily it's a place simply impossible to be held. And as of then, there were no Israeli soldiers in Gaza. The Israeli army redeployed itself around Gaza, at the same places they are now, and in some small limited forces in cycling each and one of the settlements as just to provide security. But the rest was given to the Palestinians in '94. There was no Israeli military in Gaza, unlike the situation in the West Bank. So all those slogans that currently are popped up in the air in an unlimited manner, that because the IDF left Gaza in 2005, now we have to tackle with all these very, very unpleasant realities, as I say, of mortars, of missiles, etc. This is simply not true. It happened in '94. A second question that we try to explain, why the decision of this kind was taken unilaterally. It was taken unilaterally just for the reason that at that time, and I'm talking about end of 2003, early 2004, the Palestinian Authority was led by Mr. Arafat, whom we decided, we reached a conclusion that we will never negotiate with him for many, many reasons that really we don't have the time to go into. But we believed that him, will be very unlike the present president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, whom we found at that time as a very serious, responsible, and dedicated person, somebody who opposed violence and terrorism from the first minute, and someone that him, together with the one who acted as his prime minister then, Dr. Salam Fayyad, both have changed the realities in the Palestinian Authority dramatically. I have no other word. Just to give you the numbers, if from 2000 to 2005, we counted 1,188 casualties dead, victims of the Second Intifada. From 2005 up to now, and I'm putting aside now the casualties of the recent weeks, the number was 140, less than 10%. This horrifying method of suicidal attacks that, to be very honest, that the Israeli empire, with all its enormous military capabilities, the satellites, the F-15, the F-16, the F-17, found itself totally helpless. All this disappeared mainly due to the efforts of the new Palestinian leadership, which unfortunately now is practically boycotted by the Israeli government. But that also relates to the present and the future, which is well known, as I said, and I must go back to the. But at the time, no, I don't have what to do with 1 hour. Okay, I'll try to. Okay, we didn't want to deal with Mr. Arafat. On one hand, we did understand that something must be done on the other hand, and the outcome was a decision that was taken unilaterally to leave Gaza. On November 2004, when Mr. Arafat passed away, Abbas is elected president. As of then, the coordination with the Palestinian Authority about the Gaza withdrawal was almost on a weekly basis. Not God is my witness, Mr. Al-Omri is my witness, who at that time served as a senior assistant to President Abbas, how many times we have met on this issue, and the many number of addresses of discotheques in Tel Aviv. I had to provide him in each and one of the meetings. As I said, once Abu Mazen became our counterpart, we coordinated timetables, what will be left, what will be destroyed, what facilities should be stayed on the ground as such, like agro-industrial, it's the water installation, any other premises that has any public use, like auditoriums, etc. On the other hand, it was the request of the Palestinian Authority, for instance, to destroy the private homes because of a very justified concern that they might be repossessed by elements that the Palestinian Authority considered to be unwanted. So it was, by the end of the day, a coordinated process, which raised tremendous hopes of development, of resettlement of refugees, and my friend Ray remember of building of the Gaza shore. With Abu Mazen, I think there was even some very specific conversation about a program of Israeli tourism to the new hotels that were supposed to be built there. We agreed to an international tender for construction of a deep water harbor in Gaza, to the redoing of the airport. All of it, unfortunately, the course or the track that we were all on, and in a very constructive and encouraging manner, unfortunately ended when Gaza was taken over by Hamas, which again, it's an entirely different story. And we are where we are. So to sum up, Mr. Moderator, the decision to pull out from Gaza was out of necessity, was through very painful, personally very painful process that Sharon went under, as I said, as somebody who was the builder of all these places, but as a result of this very, very deep understanding that the situation we've been there, namely an occupation of 3 million people, doomed to end. Thank you.
So Eval Gilad is next. I was actually quite kind to the first speaker, and I won't, by agreement ahead of time, given his senior status, I will not be as kind. We will proceed. Are you sitting or going?
Exactly what I wanted to say. You know, being used to clean after Dubi, I'll save the time and try to be back. Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me here today. I would like to say very shortly why disengagement, why unilaterally, that was mentioned by Dubi, and most importantly, and I hope this will come up through the questions after that, is what's the impact of it? Not just how we assess it as of today, but what is the impact of having done that 10 years ago for any future options that I am a little more optimistic than some others as of our future in that area. So why disengagement? Let me just say one thing coming from the military, and at that time I was still in service, and I fully agree with the description that Dubi described Gaza and how we managed it, but I want to make something seriously a clear point. It is not the IDF that requested to pull out of Gaza. The IDF could stay there for another 10, 20, 30 years as much as needed. It is not the IDF who decides where Israel be deployed with settlement civilians. It is the IDF to protect and defend whatever the government decides to do. It is important for you to understand, yes, all the description is correct, and it seems to be, with the cynical way Dubi describes it, as something impossible, but the IDF could stay there as long as the government decides to. This is something that important to understand. Why disengagement? We are after 10 years of talking with the Palestinians. I'm sure you all remember we started the process, Oslo as we call it, in 1993. After 10 years, we got nowhere. We're in the midst of the second intifada, as Dubi described before. Buses, restaurants have been exploded on a daily basis by suicide bombers. The second intifada was very tough, but just before that, let me remind you that in 2000, we are talking with Arafat in July 2000 in Camp David, trying to achieve a status agreement that doesn't work. And then came the Clinton parameters, which were better from the Palestinian side than what was offered during Camp David. And as Arafat said no in Camp David, Israel didn't really like all the changes, but said yes, and Arafat said no. And then we went down to Taba. Ehud Barak is the prime minister, and he knows that the only way for him to stay prime minister is to achieve an agreement with the Palestinians. So he forced us to go even further in Taba, and Arafat says no. And it took us some time to understand that it makes no difference what Israel will offer to Arafat. The point is not what is offered. He will always say no. I was one of those who made a mistake. I thought we can cut a deal with him. And I can say today that I thought so until July 2000. We couldn't start without Arafat, but we couldn't finish with him. It's a state of mind of this generation. I don't want to go into details, but it was clear to us that the question is not how much and what we offer. For whatever we offer, it won't work. It's an important point because I will try to touch upon it later. I think even today, if we try to reach final status agreement with the Palestinians in one step, I believe it won't work. It did not work during last year with all the efforts made by Secretary Kerry in the region. It did not work with Ehud Olmert's proposal to the Palestinians. He proposed final status agreement. It didn't work. It didn't work in Camp David. It didn't work in Annapolis. And I think the way forward is not trying to go to final status agreement in one step, but to something which is less than final status agreement, may not be perfect, may not be 100%, but we can do something which is 70, 80%, huge and significant change on the day-to-day life, and then create the conditions necessary for progress, and then create the better conditions for progress, and move on in a different way. If we have time, I'll talk about it a little more, what I believe can be done and should be done, and I think it's a mistake that we don't do anything now. So this is why disengagement. Last point as of why disengagement, I'm not sure you all remember, but we tried to solve all the violence and issues. So George Mitchell, that we all remember from his second term, came first time with the Mitchell report that tried to say, well, what can you do to calm and bring back things to normal and start renegotiating? And the Mitchell report was not an implementable one. So the US had to send George Tenet to define how the Mitchell report is to be implemented. And this didn't work. So the US sent another special envoy, General Zinni, to try and break down the Tenet report to step by step how we can move on. I'll save you the details. We negotiated for 12 days, Israelis, Palestinians. I was responsible for the Israeli side, and after 12 days, Zini faxed to us at the same time, to the Israelis and the Palestinians, the way the US sees the way forward. And these were not the words, take it or leave it, but the message was, we're not open for another round of negotiations. If you have any question, fine, but this is what we believe is the way forward. I read it, I bring in all my officers, advisors, we think through, and I called the Prime Minister's office. Mr. Weissglas, of course, was there, and I came at midnight, 12 a.m., to present the document to the Prime Minister, and we sit, and Sharon goes to the details and asks questions. We sit until 1:45 a.m., and the bottom line, Sharon approves it, and I go out, and I call Zini immediately. This is 1:45 a.m., and I say to him, well, it wasn't easy. We have our reservations, but the bottom line, we don't want to open it because we don't want the other side to open it, so we say yes. This made Arafat's position much tougher after we say yes, and he said no. This was much tougher, and another wave of terrorism. So when we got to the point that we understand that we need to change the order, we used to think, wrongly, that peace will bring security. And if we just talk about peace, this will bring security. And Sharon brings another concept that at the beginning the world is not ready to accept. And he says, no, guys, it is security that will bring peace. You must stop violence first if you want to talk. And we understand that the way forward is in a different order. When we come with the concept of the disengagement, it is clear to us that Gaza was never a strategic asset. This is not Jewish heritage. In all rounds of negotiations before that, it was clear that we leave Gaza. I'm talking about civilians. As Dubi mentioned before, the IDF is surrounding Gaza from outside only. So for us, Gaza was not a question at all, but we also propose to evacuate 4 settlements in the West Bank. Now I can tell you here that we did 4 settlements, Ganim, Kadim, Sanur, and Chomesh, for those who may remember the names, but we proposed to the US 2 scenarios that we can do even more, to send a very clear message. This is not Gaza first and last, but this is Gaza to be continued in the West Bank. Why unilaterally? Dubi said before, I would say in one sentence, that if we were trying to negotiate the evacuation of Gaza, we would have probably been talking today and deployed in Gaza, because the Palestinians would have requested this and we would have requested that, and we wouldn't make it. So we said, this is what we're going to do. In August 15, we'll tell you the date. We will leave. Whether you do or you don't do your expected steps as of the roadmap. We were not ready to negotiate, but we were coordinating the disengagement, the pull out with different things. I see,
Be careful.
I'll be done in a minute.
I said, be careful because
Yeah, these notes. No, I'm getting 3 hours in a minute. So I'll stop talking as of the past. We pulled out of Gaza. I will try later on to relate whether we assess it as a positive move or not as of what we see today. I will say that the last chapter has not been written yet. And the way to judge the disengagement is not now, because what we see, unfortunately, is half-baked product. We started a strategy that we did the first step, and unfortunately Sharon went to sleep. And we did not follow, but we will at some point. So if you ask me, if at the end of the day there will be a 2-state solution, which I strongly support and I hope will be the case, then I would say that the disengagement was a very important step to create the conditions for this progress, and I don't think anyone but Sharon could start it. If at the end of the day we'll end up with something that, I don't know, 1-state solution, no solution, continuing forever, regional solution, you may say that the disengagement was not a right move. But I think that this chapter had not been written yet, and if you ask my assessment, I think it was a positive move and will be proved, more importantly, as such. I'll stop here and we'll talk about the future through the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we call on our next speaker, let me just mention that we're using the card system for questions. So at the appropriate time after our fourth speaker, cards like this will be passed out. You'll have an opportunity to write your question. While we are having a little discussion among ourselves, the committee will decide how which questions do get asked. So that's a preview of what's coming up. Next, Rethal Amari. The question is, of course, what were the Palestinians thinking when the Israelis were just leaving Gaza? What did this mean from the Palestinian perspective?
All right, thank you very much. Thank you all, of course, for being here. Thank you, Steve, for the glowing introduction and the very, how shall I say, efficient moderating. And thank you, Yoram, for inviting me here and allowing me to actually, again, interact with a couple of colleagues with whom I worked very closely in the past. And I must say, on a personal note, at these days where things are so grim, I remember how grim things were at the Intifada, and yet how all of us actually worked together to move out of that. I mean, these experiences that we share is what gives me hope that even in these days, it is possible to maybe find a way forward. Now my 10 minutes will start.
No.
No, look, I mean, as I look at the Gaza Disengagement, I look at it both as a matter of history, and I will look at it in this sense, but I also look at it as a model that we need to learn from, because I agree with Ival, and I will get to that in a minute. There are lessons that we can learn that we can actually apply today, and these might be the only things possible that we can do today. Now, to start with maybe a bit of a disclaimer, I mean, I'm a lawyer by training, and we are trained to look at things, to look for the negative in things, to be very critical. And indeed, as I look at the Gaza Disengagement, I will be very critical. I will look at what went wrong. But to start, I would say that in principle, as a general statement, I think it was the right thing to do. Despite all the shortcomings, I think any Israeli evacuation of Palestinian land is a positive thing for the Palestinians. And I do believe that at the end of the day, yes, it was not an end of the occupation, etc., but it creates opportunities. Yet, as we say in Washington, some mistakes were made by many of the players. And I will maybe enumerate some of the mistakes that happened on the Israeli side or on the Palestinian side. On the Israeli side, I think the fundamental problem that we had there was the framing. It was all framed with the idea that there's no partner, which made sense when Arafat was leader, given that fact that we were in an intifada. But we got stuck with that framing when Abbas became the president. And that really narrowed the political space for Abbas to act. And equally with the issue of it being unilateral. With it being unilateral, ultimately, it became very difficult for the Palestinian Authority to actually take credit for this. And yes, in the end, we coordinated, but the coordination was more on the technical level. The political framing was put in place, and therefore, it became very difficult for me, for example, as someone who worked for the PA, to come out and say, or to take credit for this. Hamas, on the other hand, and as I will say in a minute, were very agile and adept in taking credit for it and using it politically. Now, a big part of the problem was the timing. Because during the time that it happened, we had, especially after the death of Arafat, we had two dynamics happening on the Palestinian side that made it that made it complicated to engage with this. The first was the fact that Abbas was a new leader. We were in transition, and he was in the process of consolidation. And as such, his ability to actually take action, to take political and security action, was limited to some extent. And the second, of course, was that the tension between Hamas and the PLO, or Hamas and the PA, depends how you look at it, was reaching close to a tipping point. And the disengagement came, and the way that it was a unilateral disengagement, worked politically in the benefit of Hamas. In very simple terms, Hamas, towards the, as the Gaza disengagement was being implemented, Hamas came with a very compelling slogan. Their slogan that was plastered all over Gaza was the following: 3 years of resistance produced more than 10 years of negotiations. Now, that was inaccurate, but it was a very good slogan that I could not respond to with a soundbite of the same magnitude, nor could I, even if I were to debunk that, could I have taken credit for it. So that's what I think is where on the Israeli side they got it wrong. But on the Palestinian side, we also got it wrong in many ways. The most basic one is when the idea was floated, rather than deciding to engage with it, on the Palestinian side, we rejected it. The Palestinian official position was, almost until the end, we will reject this unilateral disengagement. Now we had good reasons for that. It's unilateral, doesn't take our interest into account, etc., etc., etc. But at the bottom line, these were all reasons, but they were always also, in my view, a cop-out. We could have as easily decided to engage with it. We would have had two advantages in that case. One, we could have actually shaped it in a way that was more representative of our interest, but also, by saying no, there was a rift between the Palestinian leadership, officialdom, and the people in Gaza. As we were saying no, people in Gaza were actually waiting. You could feel the anticipation almost physically when you walk into Gaza. So our decision at that point to not engage it, I think, was the first mistake. The second and more important mistake, I believe, that we did not do enough to exert control on Gaza once Israel left. I think that was the major mistake. Now, there are many reasons for that. The fact that it was unilateral gave us no motivation to do that, no political logic, if you wish to do that. Structurally, part of the legacy of Arafat was leaving us with a very dysfunctional Palestinian Authority, and part of the legacy of the Intifada was leaving us with a very poor security sector. But ultimately, I think there was a sense on the Palestinian side that, you know what, we were not part of that, therefore we're not going to do enough. We're not going to go out of our way to actually exert control. The Israelis left, let them deal with the consequences. And in doing this, I think we have allowed Hamas to set the terms. We have lost a major opportunity to take that withdrawal and turn it into actually the nucleus of a future Palestinian state. Now, I say this not only to look at the mistakes of the past, but to look at what we can learn from these for the future. And here I would agree with Ival. I think, look, on the one hand, I don't think that right now the Palestinians and Israelis can negotiate anything. Put a Palestinian and Israeli, put Saeb Erekat and Itzhak Molcho, and tell them what color this podium is. In 5 minutes, the conversation is going to be who was voted in 1948. This is the nature of the dynamic right now. Agreement in its own right is a liability for both Abbas and for Netanyahu at the moment. So the only thing that we can work right now is to look at what unilateral measures can be taken within the realm of the possible. And I think in that way, things can be done. But there are lessons that we can learn from Gaza. The first is, I would say, the framing. Again, the framing in Gaza was there was no Palestinian partner. Any unilateralism that will be taken right now by Israel should be framed differently. And unilateralism, I believe, that should be taken by Israel would be grounded in the ongoing very strong security cooperation between the Palestinians and Israelis. And the framing of any action that will be taken by Israel should refer to that fact. Because the security cooperation, essential as it is politically costly for the Palestinians, and the ability of the PA to come and say that the action that will be taken are a reward for the security cooperation will certainly bolster this very important dynamic. Secondly, I would say there needs to be maybe better coordination than what we had. The coordination we had was very last minute towards the end of the process. I think we need stronger coordination, and in this way I think the US is in a position to play a more proactive role, because the US, and Rob is going to talk more about this, the US played an important role on the diplomatic level but had almost no presence on the ground. Things are different now, and I think we can have a more stronger coordination structure with the US role, especially when it comes to security. The scope of any future unilateral acts should be designed with a view of basically being based on the Palestinian capability of exerting control in areas that Israel evacuates. I think that was something that was not well considered during the Gaza disengagement. And for that to work, of course, the Palestinians need to re-engage with the process of institution building. Dubi mentioned the progress made by President Abbas and by Prime Minister Fayyad on building Palestinian institutions, whether security or civilian. Unfortunately, over the last 2 or 3 years, many of these developments, these institutional developments, have chipped, have been reduced. Fayyad has been pushed out, and I see a return of some of the dynamics that we had under Arafat coming back to the PA. These are very dangerous when it comes to, the lack of institutional development will make it very difficult to actually move into any kind of unilateral action that is sustainable and that is positive. Now, unilateral measures of the kind that are possible today will by definition be limited, will not end the conflict. They will not end the occupation, will not give us a two-state solution. But they will do two things. First of all, they will allow the Palestinians who are engaged in cooperation with Israel to say that this is producing something. Will allow us to actually counter the Hamas narrative that says that only violence pays with Israel. And it will also rehabilitate the two-state solution. And I will conclude where I started. When I look at the situation today, when I look at the situation over the last 10 years maybe, since Gaza, there's nothing positive that had happened. For me, and for my generation, we can look back at the Gaza Disengagement, we can look back at the handshake in the South Lawn of the White House, and this will give us hope. For a generation that came of age over the last 10, 15 years, the only thing that they have seen was failure. And therefore, it is important for us right now to provide this generation with some success. Yes, we will not give them the ultimate prize of a two-state solution immediately. Things are not ready. But we will give them something that will show that peace, that cooperation, that diplomatic means will actually produce something. I think this is the challenge. I think it's doable. I'm not sure we have the political leadership on either side to do that, but if there's any way forward, it will be in this coordinated unilateral way, learning from them some of the mistakes and some of the successes that we had in Gaza. Thank you again.
Anyway, Rob Dineen, an old friend, and was there on the scene in Washington. You can imagine how astonished Washington was. I think it was Elliot Abrams was approached in Rome. That this idea was brewing by Israel. Everyone thought it was not possible that Sharon, of all people, would take this action. And I think that the Bush administration deserves a lot of credit for running with the idea, despite, I guess, Rob will tell us, a lot of people's misgivings. But was every opportunity taken? Did it work? Rob Dineen.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you. And my deep apologies that I can't be with you all in Los Angeles today. It's somewhat ironic because I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I'm a product of the University of California system. So I'm deeply sorry not to be there. And I'm also sorry because all four of the gentlemen on the panel are friends of mine. And I've had the joy of working with three of you and knowing all four of you very well. So thank you for this opportunity. As I've listened to all of you, I feel like there are really two conversations going on in parallel. First, there's the historic question about what happened. And then there's a second question about the situation today. And I'd like to start first with the what happened part of it, because as someone who's trained as an historian, I think the context matters. And you cannot straight line from an historical situation to today. And I was doing some reading this afternoon of the various memoirs and notes from that situation. And what strikes me is how much has changed in 10 years. And the situation is so dramatically different, for better and for worse, than the situation was then. So let me just first set the stage. And recall, we had, in the United States, I was the director for the Israeli-Palestinian affairs at the National Security Council at the White House. The first inkling that we had of the idea of disengagement came within a certain context. It was only a few years after 9/11. We were engaged heavily in the war on terror, and we had just gone to war with Iraq. We had had an attempt at high-level diplomacy. We had President Bush had gone to the Middle East, had hosted two big meetings, one in Aqaba, the other in Sharm el-Sheikh, in which he brought together the newly created Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, and Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. effort to jumpstart negotiations was crushed, really, by two dynamics intertwined. One was the horrific terrorism that was taking place as a result of the Second Intifada. And combined with this was then the political undermining of Prime Minister Abbas by the then President Arafat. And so understand at that time, Prime Minister Abbas resigned soon after when he realized he had no running room politically. We had then Prime Minister Abu Allah. We had yet a great clamoring for political progress, and there were other activities taking place. If you recall, there were initiatives such as the Geneva Initiative, and the Geneva Initiative weighed very heavily on all of us, and this helped frame the framework. It meant that while we were busy pursuing what was then referred to as the roadmap, which was implement the president's vision of two states, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security, we were going nowhere with the implementation of the roadmap. So against this backdrop in which the political process was stuck, in which there was ongoing terrorism, in which the occupation was going on, along comes this idea of unilateral disengagement, unilateral withdrawal. Now, Steve, I know the reference you made about Eliot and Rome. There's a history there that's actually, I take issue with the historical narrative, but I guess I'll have to write my own memoirs to correct that. It's a footnote. The important part was, and I'll remember this day till the day I pass, I hope, which is the following. Dov Weissglas came to the White House, and he laid out for us, for Condoleezza Rice, the then National Security Advisor, what Israel had in mind. And I'll never forget that we walked out of the meeting in shock. Here, the Israelis had come and said, we are leaving Gaza and parts of the West Bank. And as they've all said, it was not Gaza first. The proposal evolved over time. The original concept was actually much bigger. It was all of Gaza and major parts of the West Bank. And if I recall correctly, the original list that was presented to us encompassed well over a dozen settlements in the West Bank, not just the 4 that wound up. And so the idea was Israel was going to leave. And our first question was, well, how does this relate to the political process that is underway? And the answer was that unilateral withdrawal was the second best option. That we, Israel, were committed to the roadmap, we were told. But if this process goes nowhere, then we will move to disengagement. Now, this was kind of curious to me, because it suggested that if the political process went forward, we would have talks. And if we didn't have political talks, then Israel would actually evacuate territory. And it raised for me a great concern, which was, what about the whole idea of land for peace? This was land for a failure of negotiations. So how does that work? I raised those concerns, but it was a minor concern because you have to remember the context. Bombs were going on, the political process was going nowhere, Palestinian politics were stuck, and there was the sense that if we didn't do something, and if Israel didn't do something, something else was going to be imposed on all of us that would be much less favorable to all of us. And again, war on terror, war with Iraq, other things going on in the world. So our view was, this is bold, this is interesting. We had this idea at the time, we had built into the roadmap an idea of sequencing, that land would only be evacuated later after fruitful negotiations. So how does this work? How does the withdrawal fit into negotiations? Because withdrawal is not supposed to come till what was then referred to as phase 3 of the roadmap. And Condoleezza Rice said, look, we can't be so rigid and wedded to the roadmap that we're going to tell the Israelis, no, you can't leave occupied territory. Stay. How can we do that? We can't do that. So that was a major concern, but it was one that we had to overcome because the precedent was just too bold. Now, the other element that was disconcerting was the way Doobie described it, and I'll say it openly, and we're all friends here, and this is now important history, was the idea that we said, well, what will happen? You leave, and what happens? And the answer was, we don't know. We'll build a wall, we'll build a fence, and we'll throw the keys over it, and it will be their problem. Okay. It was bold and dramatic. But this idea, again, the theme was that of a punitive nature, that this was being done almost as punishment to the Israelis for not negotiating, to the Palestinians for not negotiating, rather than as a reward for negotiations. And so again, that raised concern. A, the punitive nature. B, the notion that how could this translate into any political benefits? And then C, and something we didn't allude to, but it became the major focus of American efforts. The argument that was put forward to us is, look, and it was put forward by Doobie, and you can ask him about it in the Q&A. Doobie said, look, we're going to do this unilaterally. We're going to do this because it's in our interest. But we could use some help. Oh, what kind of help? Well, we need some American backing for this. Oh, what does that mean? Well, this came to evolve into what became historically known as the April letter given by President Bush to Prime Minister Sharon. And indeed, the subsequent months that we spent after the initial rollout of the idea through the actual day in which the initiative was announced in the White House focused around the content of this letter. And what could the United States do and say about what Israel was doing in order to help Prime Minister Sharon sell it back at home? And without saying as much, what the Israelis were in essence saying was, if we sell this as a gift to the Palestinians, it will never fly. So therefore, we almost have to sell it as something despite the Palestinians not in favor of them. Now, this was very difficult for us because that was not our view. Our view was this has to be a stepping stone to a political process. And that's what led to the language that's embedded in that letter, which tried to balance two competing interests. An Israeli interest, which was to say, what Israel is doing is backed by the United States, is an important step. Yet at the same time, for us to say whatever is being done is not creating facts on the ground of a political nature. And so, therefore, we ensured and sought to ensure, and it took months and months of negotiations over the content of what we and they would say about what was being done, that would ensure that whatever was being done on the ground would not jeopardize or forfeit or prejudge the final disposition of a peace settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And so the idea was that in the end, everything would have to be mutually agreed upon by the Israel and the Palestinians, and everything else that was done was going to be of an interim nature. But that said, there were certain realities that we would tilt towards. And this balance became embedded in the letter, which at the time was highly controversial because the United States was, here we were, 4 years after the Clinton parameters, and going much further in articulating specifics about what might be reasonable to expect from a final status agreement. So in essence, we were providing observations and insights but at the same time trying not to prejudge the final outcome. The Israelis, of course, wanted us to prejudge the outcome on their terms. Well, that's what negotiations are about, trying to find a middle ground, and that's what we did. But at the end of the day, we were struck by it. We thought it set an important precedent. Israel was withdrawing from settlements. Israel was withdrawing from territory. This was the first time that Israel was leaving land since the disengagement agreements that Kissinger had brokered between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria. And so the view was, if this can be a stepping stone on the way to something else of a political nature, particularly given everything on the ground, that's great. But I would caution in trying to understand what happened then, that what happened then happened then. And I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about unilateralism and disengagement today and what lessons may or may not be applicable today. But the situation, as Gates pointed out, is quite different. I would argue today we do have an address. Today we do have a functioning security services on the Palestinian side that we did not have. Those are the plus sides. On the negative side, we also have a divided Palestinian polity in which it is two-headed, one in Gaza and one in the West Bank. That's a big problem. We also have in Israel a government today, and Steve, I read your body language, I'm about to wrap up. We do have in Israel a leadership that does not have, that to date has not evidenced any inkling of wanting to take the initiative. With those components, it's hard to see how unilateralism could come about, let alone be implemented. But I imagine that if it were to come forward, we, the United States, would be interested in discussing it. I'll end there. And
Thank you.
Los Angeles.
I want to ask a few questions of the panel. First, a yes or no question for each of you, and that is, if you had it to live over again, would you do the same thing in terms of Gaza? Would your country do the same thing? And what would you change? Let's start reversed.
The answer has to be, it depends. If we had the political alignment today, that we had then the answer would be no. But if we had a political alignment as we have it today, then the answer would be yes. That is, the biggest flaw, the biggest drawback to all of this, from an American point of view, of wanting to ultimately see a political process and a negotiated settlement between Israelis and Palestinians, was this had nothing political for moderate Palestinians, and indeed seemed like it might be a reward for those who wanted to drive Israel out of territory. And how to translate it into a political benefit for the Palestinians was the challenge, and it still remains the challenge. But at the time, it was less of a challenge because who was in power? You had Arafat and Muqatta and Ramallah. You had Abu Allah as prime minister, who wasn't doing very much. Today, you have a prime minister, or rather a president, who, for all his flaws, and we could spend the rest of the evening talking about that, is committed to peace, is committed to peaceful change, and is in control of security forces who control territory. It's a different reality. So the answer is yes. Today we would like the withdrawal part, but we would not like the unilateral part, and we would seek to try to square that circle.
Okay. Raith, what would you answer?
I would certainly do it again, but with taking into some account some of the things that I mentioned. First, on the Israeli side, I think it's important to frame it as an act that is done because the Palestinian-Israeli security cooperation has created the right kind of environment. This will turn the security cooperation from something that is a political liability into something that's actually a political asset in the Palestinian discourse. On the Palestinian side, I would, as I said, I would actually urge the Palestinians to take it more seriously. This is an opportunity. This was an opportunity. Had we played it right, we had real challenges. Of course, I mentioned we were in transition and there was a question of consolidation. Yet this was our opportunity to actually establish our authority in a way that is meaningful, not only vis-a-vis the Israelis, but domestically vis-a-vis Hamas and others, and we failed to do that. Internationally, I would say in preparation for this, I would lean heavily on the Palestinians to resume the process of building institutions. When you create a vacuum, you need the ability to come and fill that vacuum. And absent strong institutions, be they security, be they civilian, the vacuum could actually end up being filled by negative players. Not to say that today the institutions do not exist, but I do feel that since the departure of Prime Minister Fayyad, this has really stopped being a primary objective. And I think not only for the Palestinians, but sadly for the international community that seem to be too fixated on the flashy kind of negotiations to the detriment of the actual, maybe boring yet essential work of building institutions and building the capability to be able to implement these kind of, be it agreements or be it unilateral action.
Eva?
whatever serves the future vision we have, which is two-state solution, and we can move toward this in a way that serves both sides, I will do. So for me, if whatever step taken serves the vision in the future and do not do anything against it or prejudge or prevent or whatever, I will do it. I will try to do what works for both sides because I believe a win-win scenarios plays much better than a win-lose one. I would not exclude unilateral actions, but I will try to do coordinated unilateral actions on both sides. So each side will do what it needs to do regardless what happens on the other side. We had many programs in the past that we used to call it the zipper. I mean, you do this, we do that. You do this, you do that. If you don't do, I don't do. And each side, including the Israelis, to be honest, were looking to the other side failures, trying to find an excuse not to do its part. So I'll try to do something which doesn't have this kind of sequencing. This is what you are expected to do, you do your job. And this is what you're expected to do, and you do your job. Fayyad told me at one of the meetings we had when he was Prime Minister, he told me the following. He said, Eival, you know, Israel was not established in 1948. It was declared in 1948. But for many years before that, for a decade or more, you prepared it. What I'm trying to do is not to declare a Palestinian state. I'm trying to prepare it. Once we get to an agreement, how would I govern if I do not prepare, not just financial institutions, but all others, which I thought is right, and we should support it. So if we could have a plan that I'm happy to speak more after that in 2 or 3 years we evacuate the West Bank east of the barrier to start with, and the Palestinians are prepared to govern what we pull out from much better than what happened in Gaza, then I will support it.
As I tried to explain, for us, the pullout from Gaza was a step necessitated by the understanding that we must minimize the problem, we must reduce the conflict, we must reduce the friction between nations, and we must facilitate a future solution, though that at the time we didn't know, or we didn't figure out what would be the final layout of the solution. But since territory was always the core, the basis of the conflict, we knew that if we touch the territory, I touch in the sense of giving away to the Palestinian, the problem automatically, evidently, will be somehow minimized. So in this context, it was necessary then, the basic circumstances have not been changed, and it is necessary now. The only retrospective correction I would make as part of your question is, would we know then? Well, again, it's very hypothetical because Abu Mazen didn't exist then, as Ray just mentioned, on September 2003, in view of some devastating 2 suicidal attacks in Jerusalem, if you remember, one which brought the death of 42 people. It was Abbas approaching Abu Mazen, and he demanded some urgent authorities to tackle with Hamas. Arafat, of course, declined it. Abu Mazen angrily resigned, left to Doha, and Ahmed Karia, Abu Allah, became the prime minister. Now, Mr. Abu Allah, in his typical way, already announced that he is not going to handle any issues of securities, and in a way, he switched back all security authorities back to Arafat. Well, Arafat appointed a sort of National Security Council. We knew that this is worth nothing, and actually we are at square one. So I said, Arafat is back in town in the sense that he is the decision maker on security, and security was our major concern then. Abu Mazen, whom we had tremendous hopes, is gone, and so as a compromise, again, as a compromise between the need to do something and the inability to do it with the Palestinians, we have done it unilaterally. Now, would it all happen today with a party, I mean, with a counterpart like Mr. Abbas, I strongly assert that we would do it with him, coordinated with him, because along those 10 years, I mean, 3 years from my own personal experience, and it's 6 years later after I left the government, we found him serious, responsible, determined, and most of all, somebody who historically always was against terrorism, and so would we have him then? No question that the pull out from Gaza would be done with full accordance with him. So this is the change that would be dictated by different realities, would it be then the situation.
All right. Well, in the course of our panelists answering this question, I've received a large number of questions. If we really got to ask them all, we would be here literally all night.
What's wrong?
But there are some tricks of the trade in moderating land that I will try to use. Some of the questions are to individuals. Some of the questions are to the group. I'll start with a group question. I would say that at the moment, Rob Dineen does not have a question. I suspect because he, most of the questions were written before he started to speak. And I can always ask one myself. But meanwhile, let us begin. And I'm going to ask several questions that I think from a very quick reading are pretty much the same. And not all of you have to answer, but perhaps a couple of you can answer one and a couple of you can answer another to keep this under control. So question one, doesn't what happened in Gaza, isn't what happened in Gaza conclusive evidence of what could happen if Israel allowed a Palestinian state on the West Bank? Another question, how do you see the future of a two-state solution when it is predicted that in 10, 15 years there will be as many Jews as Arabs in the West Bank? Let's end there. There are plenty more in this vein. Anybody want to take the question on, Ray?
I don't think that what happened in Gaza is an indication of what's going to happen in the West Bank for a very simple reason. I think the Palestinian approach to security has fundamentally changed from the days of Arafat, who, again, I mean, you can say a lot of things about him, positive or negative, but he did look at violence and terrorism as a tool of policy, if you will.
It's a legitimate measure of national struggle.
I mean, it's a tool of policy.
Yes, okay.
It's a tool
That's
that he
were
was,
his own words.
Yeah. And of course, for the Israelis, as you rightly said, this is the kind of the core of the whole thing. And I think this fundamentally changed when Abbas, who I worked for a long time, again, as Rob mentioned, he has many faults, and I'm happy to engage on those. But one thing for sure, he is someone who is committed to nonviolence. Actually, we were talking as we were walking in here about his speech when he was prime minister in Aqaba, in which he called for the end to the armed intifada, which cost him his job at that point. But he believed very, very strongly in that. And this is not only words. Actually, what happened during the time of Prime Minister Fayyad is that the US and the Israelis, seeing that there is a true seriousness among the Palestinians when it comes to security, have worked with the Palestinians and with Jordanian help as well to recreate a Palestinian security sector, to rebuild the Palestinian security sector in ways which are exemplary. Today, it's almost counterintuitive, but today what we see, because of the security cooperation and the seriousness of which the Palestinians take security, we see the IDF and the Shin Bet being the strongest advocates for Palestinian interests in the Israeli system. Interestingly, at the beginning of the current wave of violence, as we had ministers, Raf Leighton's center saying it's all about Palestinian incitement. Yes, incitement is a problem. Yet you had the IDF coming out and saying, no, actually, the Palestinians are working with us to end or to suppress the violence. So I see a very fundamental change coming from the Palestinian side, from not taking security seriously, which allowed for Hamas to emerge and which allowed for many things, to a situation where the Palestinians understand the centrality of this. And I think having that in mind, we can certainly avoid a repeat of Gaza. Now, We have to do it smartly. We have to work on the Palestinian Authority, as I said, building its legitimacy, not only in security, but in terms of reform. At the end of the day, Palestinian Authority that is not reformed, Palestinian Authority that is seen by its public as corrupt, will not have the moral standing maybe to be stable in a long term in the West Bank. Yet working on reform and working on security could produce a two-state reality in the West Bank, in the West Bank and Israel that is stable, that is from a security point of view acceptable, and that is sustainable from a governance point of view if you create the right kind of governance structures.
I think this question is very important because this is a very natural and common concern whether what happened in Gaza after the pullout may not repeat itself in the West Bank. Unfortunately, the Gaza experiment, and Gaza was an experiment to a great extent. Again, we spoke about the development, the future plans about Gaza. Would they been succeed, as Abu Mazen himself in one of our meetings said, that what he will do is he will turn Gaza to Singapore. I remember that was his vision. And needless to elaborate what would happen if that would succeed, but it did not. And the reason is very simple. Palestinian security organizations or apparatus in Gaza completely failed on June 2007, when about 1,500 warriors of Hamas defeated over 20,000 security people of the Palestinian Authority. They dropped them out of tops of buildings. They tied them up to power poles and shot the back part of their knees. They slaughtered over 800 of them. Many of them were hospitalized in Israeli hospitals after the kind of atrocities took place in Gaza. And in, I think, one day, the entire official Palestinian security forces in Gaza disappeared, and Gaza fell into the hand of Hamas, and all the rest is history. All the rest was happening. So the question, I'm sorry to rephrase the question, but by the way, I learned it from Sharon. He normally in his interviews always would tell the interviewer, "This is not your question. Let me tell you what your question is." So let me tell you what your question is. Your question should be, is it possible that the West Bank will fall in the hands of the Hamas? Because if that will happen, the Gaza reality will duplicate itself in the West Bank, no question. Here, again, we have with us a greater expert than us on Palestinian affairs. I do believe, but again, it's very unprofessional, that the probabilities that Hamas will take over the West Bank are very, very low. It's different society. It's entirely different matter. But that should be the concern. As long the West Bank is controlled by the Palestinian National Authority in its present structure, and specifically under the leadership of President Abbas, I say it certainly, I see no serious concern to think that what happened in Gaza will repeat itself or will duplicate itself in the West Bank.
All right, I have, I'm sure Ariel Giladi wants to get in here. Instead, I'm going to ask 3 questions of him. And so in the next round, he'll be the first to speak, and you can pick up something from the previous. Do you believe a two-state, this is not directed to you, to everybody. Do you believe a two-state solution is possible when many believe that there is, the professor in me points out some misspelling here, there is no solution the Palestinians will accept, recognizing the Jewish state and the Palestinians' praise of the killers of Jews as martyrs and heroes. Similarly, but in a different twist, with Israeli public opinion shifting to the right and West Bank settlement contributing, continuing to expand, and with violence surging, including independent violent attacks, single attacker, how do you foresee a political climate emerging that would allow for further progress towards an agreement that would be accepted by the people for peace? And finally, are there any ways that Israel is still engaged with Gaza since 2005? What kind of engagement, if any, is still needed going forward, i.e. control of airspace, access, etc. So others will have a chance to respond on all of these, but the first that I owe to is Eval Giladi on any of the 5 questions we've had so far.
I'll start with the previous one, try to do it
Please.
shortly. The question whether there is a risk that if Israel pulls out of the West Bank will fall in the hands of the Hamas. And I hope both of my colleagues, I've been seated between 2 lawyers today. I hope they are right when they say it's different society, better educated, higher income, and so forth, and I hope they are right when they say this will not happen. But I would like to ask you, if the risk that this will happen, should Israel stay there forever to keep the Fatah in power? Let me tell you what the Hamas guy is telling me. They all ask me the following: are you for democracy? You all probably will say yes. They say, well, you're for democracy only if you like the results. Because in 2006, January 25, 2006, there were elections. Everybody says these were fair and honest elections. And since then, you guys support the loser. So I can tell you, for many years, I myself went or sent troops, some of them didn't come back, truly to defend the state of Israel. Should I send my son to keep Abu Mazen in office? That's a tough question for me. So if you ask me, should we stay in the West Bank to keep the Hamas out of control? It's a tough question. I don't say no, but I would say it's for the Palestinians to decide who they want to be governed by. We have an interest, we can influence, but I don't think we should be the one to keep this one or that one in office. Second point, do I believe that the two-state solution is viable with all the risks? My answer is absolutely yes. And I would even say more. If we do that, there is one way, I believe, to push out the Hamas. And this is by showing success to those who believe that by political process, they gain. So if you create a process that leads to two-state solution, I think this is something that strengthens significantly, a lot more than all other ways, the good side of the Palestinians. And thirdly, I would say, if you ask me how you do that, I will repeat to what I've said before. I will not go to final status agreement in one step, because I think this is not doable today. None of the parties is prepared. But if, for example, just imagine the following: in the next 2-3 years, Netanyahu announced that he is going to evacuate all settlements east of the barrier. I'll give you some numbers, and I'll try to do it shortly. Stephen, you feel like I'm taking too long time, stop me. We've created the fence that I'm sure you all know. We call it barrier, fence, wall, whatever word you want to use. We created the following facts. 76% of the settlers, not the settlements, of the settlers are on the west of the fence. These are what I call the big blocks. These people effectively live in Israel. 24% of the settlers that are east of the barrier, these are isolated settlement in the most populated Palestinian areas. They know what everybody knows, that at the end of the day, they will not be there. So if you announce today that in the next 2 years, and I'll save you the details with financial compensation package and different things, you create the formula and you encourage people to start moving out willingly. And many of them will. Not all, but many of them will. And if you live in a settlement with 25 families, just imagine 5, 6, 7 families are moving out. And after 3 months, another 3, 4 moving out. You find yourself 7, 8 families spread around. The level of services drop. The supermarket shut down because there are no people to sell. Instead of 5 buses a day, you have only 1. Your children has no more friends, no after-school activities. People will move. Not all, but you can start the process. I wouldn't start it unless the government is prepared to go to the end, because doing halfway is very bad, just leaving weak settlements there. But if this is the case, and I'll encourage as many people as possible to move in 2 years, in the 3rd year, I believe we'll be left with a core ideology, 10 to 15,000 people that we'll have to remove, as we did in Gush Katif in Gaza. But why should I confront 73,000 people if I can deal with 10 or 15 after 2 years? So in the 3rd year, we do something like the disengagement, and just imagine that in 3 years' time, the West Bank, 92% of the land, 99.3% of the people are totally free of Israeli. When they want to go from Jenin in the north to Hebron in the south, they don't have any checkpoint, no Israeli, no soldiers, no nothing. 100% of Gaza is empty. of Israeli soldiers or civilians. 92% of the West Bank, 99.3% of the people. Connect the two, and here are the conditions for a Palestinian state to be established that Israel not only will recognize, will support and vote for. And they'll have a seat in the UN and International Air Code and all symbols of sovereignty. This is not final status agreement. But you can change the situation on the ground significantly in 3, 4, if it takes 5 years, that's not a problem. But everybody must believe that we mean business when we do that. And if you start to do that, if you remember what I said before when Fayyad said, I'm preparing to govern, and we are evacuating after 3, 4 years, the West Bank is empty, you connect the two, we have a Palestinian state that we can negotiate with for final status agreement. I would like to negotiate final status agreement with a semi-state actor. At the moment, we talk to different militias, whoever. We talk to Abu Mazen because he is much better than the Hamas. I do not recommend to talk to the Hamas, but I am not sure that Abu Mazen truly represents the Palestinians. I would like to have a Palestinian state, a semi-state actor recognized by the UN, and then we will have final status negotiations between two governments at the same level. And can we finalize that? Absolutely yes. If the Hamas will be controlling them, if you ask me, having my IDF background, can we deal with the Palestinian state, whatever the Hamas will do? Please forgive me for saying it. Yes, absolutely yes.
It was wonderful to hear you, Eval, but I do believe that in order to elaborate about what you have said, we should move into a different part of the campus, maybe the astrophysics, or I want to be very concrete. Under the current Israeli government, there will be no negotiation, no solution. There will be no one doghouse who would be taken out from the most isolated, remote, unlawful post, period. And since Israel, in its current political structure, is unwilling to give up even a part of an inch out of the areas that were occupied in '67, all the rest is exceptionally interesting, and I'm serious, but I don't think we should waste time on it. It is not part, the Israeli public, I mean, the vast Israeli public didn't move to the right. You know, when we, for the first time, published so it was just the vague, virginal ideas of pulling out from Gaza, and ever since we made a monthly public opinion poll, the support of the disengagement of Gaza along those 2 years, from the very moment it was initially contemplated and until the final execution, never went under 66%. That was not changed. The majority of the Israeli public still believe in a two-state solution, still believe is against the occupation to this or other degree, and would like to see us living here in an Israeli or Jewish state, and the Palestinian respectfully living in a Palestinian state. This is still, I believe, it's shared by the most of the Israelis. Fortunately or unfortunately, at the current political structure of Israeli government, which even Mr. Netanyahu can be considered moderate, it's mere talkings. I mean, nothing will happen. When poor Mr. Kerry, until he was, by certain parts of our government, he was tagged as anti-Semitist and we kicked him out of the country. But before he turned to be as anti-Semitist, and we, in this exhausting shuttle diplomacy, came back and forth for 3 weeks, I do not think that he was managed in 1 year even to bring the parties to agree on an agenda for the discussions. Needless to say that there was no any talks or any exchange on the substance. Just one word for you. The Likud, which is the party in government, which is a party government, it's a very democratic party in the sense that all its candidates to the Knesset, I mean to the parliament, to the government, are elected by the registered members in a very genuine process. between 1/3 up to 40%, and again, the numbers are very inaccurate, of the Likud registered members are settlers. They joined the Likud in masses after the pullout from Gaza, exactly for the reasons that I've just indicated. When they realized that public opinion in Israel, when doomsday is coming, like what happened in Gaza, so public opinion is not with them. And allow me to tell, I remember in one of these very, heavily loaded, emotional meetings we had with the leadership of the settlers, Sharon, they told Sharon that would he dare to continue with these ideas of pull out from Gaza, they will send 3 million people to the streets. They told him, we will block every single junction, the airport, the railways, 3 million people. He sort of very quietly said to them that he would suggest them to start with 3,000 because 3 million, it's a bit of a challenge. Let's start with the 3,000. What happened is 2 weeks before the actual operation, Kfar Maimon, which is a village not far from Gaza, a demonstration named then as mother of all demonstrations, okay? Let me tell you, according to the police evaluation, there were 10,000 people came. According to the settlers' evaluation, I think there was 15 or 20,000.
15, not 50.
15,
yeah.
1-5. But whatever, a number very far from 3 million. When these guys who are very serious and politically very sophisticated, and most of all very devoted and committed, because unlike us who enjoy these incredible meetings, but then we go home having dinner and go to sleep, they fight over their homes. It's almost third or fourth generation on these hills, on these areas. For them, it's a real game, unlike the rest citizens of the independent state of Tel Aviv. So when they realized that when a day comes, the public is not with them, as I just stated, the people didn't show at Kfar Maimon, they took over the Likud. They took over the Likud by a mass registration into the Likud. Now, to become a Likud member, what I need is 40 shekel and an ID, not even updated, to file a form and become a Likud member. So what happened in the Likud primaries, which is this most crucial political event in Israel, much more than the general election, they dictate today who's going to be the members of Knesset, the members of parliament, who's going to be members of the government, period. And Mr. Netanyahu, that his main commitment is to the continuation of his position, and it's a good one, as everybody knows. Well, the security, I mean, his personal security is a bit of a nuisance because of these 80 people who are running around him all the time, but all the rest is a pretty interesting job, knows that if he would dare, as I say, to talk about an inch, this is the end of his term, and he doesn't want to see the end of his term. He was here in the United States, I think it was the GA or somewhere. No, in Washington when
CAP, Center for American Progress.
when somebody asked him about a possibility of further.
Might be considered.
He said, the poor darling said might be considered because he was tired, and he apparently had the same moderator who was, was kicking his words. And you should see the scandal. So Mr. Bennett, he's the political partner, in a closed meeting of his supporters, said, well, the Prime Minister had this misspell about further disengagement. I shot him between his eyes. He learned it in his military career. He was an officer, and that was the end of the idea. Then immediately, of course, a clarification was published that he didn't say it, and if he said it, it was not properly understood. He meant unilateral steps against the Palestinian, not unilateral steps, etc. So these ideas, which are very true, I mean, in terms of hypothetical formulation, at the present time are totally irrelevant as long the current political structure in Israel is unchanged.
Let's get Rob Danin in here.
Because one of the things that I find missing in this conversation, or at least what I think is problematic here, is we talk about either negotiations or steps on the ground. And in a sense, any way that we can move forward, either unilaterally or through negotiations or through bilateral work, has to take into account domestic politics or political life on both sides. And what I tried to describe in my introductory comments was that we were very attuned to the Israeli political needs. That is, we were trying to help Prime Minister Sharon sell his disengagement, his withdrawal back at home. The problem was, in doing so, we were not attuned to the Palestinian political realities that would therefore create. Put another way, we did not, in Palestinian politics, there are basically two paths that have been pursued towards achieving political aims: violence, terrorism, or negotiations. And those are the two paths. And in essence, you feed into one of two narratives. You either feed into a narrative that you gain political, goals through negotiations, or you gain it through violence. And what we didn't sufficiently, I think, appreciate with the withdrawal and the way that it had to be couched, and I stressed that it was almost phrased as something punitive towards the Palestinians, that the failure of negotiations led to the disengagement, led to a whole narrative in Israel that Israel was leaving Gaza almost despite the Palestinians, almost to punish them. There was a negative tone. It wasn't, these are potential partners and we hope it can lead to a future path. So this has consequences. It helps create a narrative that steadfastness and intransigence, combined with, unfortunately, violence, is what gets the Israelis to move. At least this is the way it gets translated back into Palestinian political narrative. And so, therefore, who benefits from that? Unfortunately, the bad guys. And we've seen this time and time again where steps, Israel releasing 1,000 prisoners to Hamas and then not wanting to release prisoners to Fatah has an impact within Palestinian politics. And so the lesson from all this is we have to be attuned. The reality is we have to be attuned. We, the United States, and those of us who are going to pursue any kind of peacemaking in that part of the world, we have to be attuned to what our actions are going to have in the political narratives of both sides, and not just one side, but both sides. And that means that if we're going to pursue anything, be it a peace process, be it a unilateral withdrawal, we have to be able to create a positive narrative that helps explain that what we are doing is actually a result and going to benefit those who are the good guys, those who want to resolve their conflicts through peaceful means, and not the bad guys, which are the guys who exist who are wanting to blow themselves up or blow up Israelis or what have you. And so the danger in all of this has been that the narrative of no partner becomes self-fulfilling. And that's the danger today, and I think that's what Gabe was trying to speak to. And so the answer to all this is a process we subsequently did fall into, or not fall into, we designed with Annapolis. Because keep in mind, what was Annapolis? And this came after the disengagement. This was an effort that tried to combine three key elements in one. It combined the security cooperation that Gabe has spoken to. It combined the economic improvement on the ground, led by Salam Fayyad, that Yuval has spoken to. But none of that could be possible without a third component, which is a political process and negotiations. You cannot have any one of those elements independent of the other. And so you can have economic progress, you can have security cooperation, you can have political negotiations. But for any of those to work, you need all three to be working in tandem. And that, to me, is one of the lessons we've learned, both in the positive sense and also in the negative sense.
Yeah, Maybe let me just kind of respond to the challenge that you threw, Rob, about rooting everything in reality. Look, I mean, if we look at things in reality right now, the current set of characters, nothing will be done. Dubi spoke about Bibi, and you're more of an expert on Israeli politics than I am. On the Palestinian side, I think Abu Mazen would like a two-state solution, but he lacks the energy, he lacks the I don't want to say the legitimacy, but at least the traction among his public to do that. And frankly, we have not even started talking about the current US administration, which has not been exemplary in the way that they have approached the issue. But saying that, let me say a word in defense of, what is it, astrophysics? Of some of these ideas that you presented. You know, sometimes ideas can actually matter. I mean, you both, I think a number of people mentioned the effect that the Geneva Initiative had on the thinking of coming up with the disengagement. I'm sure it was not the deciding factor, but if you have a dearth of ideas and you start challenging this by producing real ideas that actually are implementable and can have traction, it can push political leaders to act, or at least can create a platform to challenge political leaders. So I think some of the ideas that you're presenting, Eval, would be very interesting to see how they can play out in a political context. If I may very quickly respond to the actual questions, which in terms of the Gaza and Israel. Look, I mean, clearly the withdrawal, the disengagement was not the end of the occupation in Gaza. Israel continues to control the airspace and the maritime, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yet I would say there are two ways of looking at the situation. You look at all of the imperfect parts, and there are many, and decide to do nothing because of that, find an excuse. Or you look at actually some of the positive sides. At the end of the day, Israel did get out of Gaza. And within that space, limited as it is, you can actually take matters into your own hand. And I think this is where, on the Palestinian side, this is where we failed. We looked for the excuse, and we found many legitimate excuses, and we did nothing. So just a question, I mean, just something to throw out there in terms of how do you think with the issues. Incitement. There was a question about incitement, and I think it's worth responding to. And it's, first of all, I mean, let me be very clear. Incitement in and of itself is wrong, has to be combated, has to be countered, has to be, identified, and we have to call people who engage in it on it. Yeah, I don't think that yet. I mean, having said that, I do not believe that, love and acceptance and whatnot are preconditions for a peace deal. Let me look at actually the longest standing peace deal that Israel has in the region with Egypt. I would challenge anyone here to find more than a handful of Egyptians who actually like Israel. Incitement. I look at Jordan, which has a great peace deal with Israel, whose government has been exemplary in the way that they engage with Israel. I think Jordan plays a tremendous role. Yet, I was reading a Jordanian newspaper 2 days ago in Arabic, and a long article about how Jews control America. Basic Elders of Zion type nonsense. Yet, these peace deals stuck. Why did they stick? Not because we asked everyone to become suddenly to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. They stuck because each of the players, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, in their cases, felt that their interests were served by these deals. And therefore, you had a peace deal between Israel and Egypt, even under a Muslim Brotherhood government, actually stuck. So as I look at peace between Palestinians and Israelis, and I must confess I don't like the word peace, even though I get paid for being a peace process guy, I would look at arrangements. I look at it as a divorce. What does each side need as a minimum to meet their interest? I will do that, unlike any divorce. I'll be happy if we become friends, and if we don't, I can still live with it.
Of course, divorces don't always go well, but at any rate, interesting analogy. Well, by good luck or bad luck, Eval is going to get the last word. My Nazarian Center handlers have told me to end at 7 o'clock. So, Eval, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll be very short as astrophysics. I would say the following. On the way here, we walked, Ray and me, and Ray said, well, I know Dubi is going to attack Netanyahu. I'm going to attack Abu Mazen. What you going to do? I said, I'm going to attack both. So I fully agree when we say the current leadership is not prepared, is not ready, and is not willing to do anything on both sides. And that would even be fair enough to say more responsibility lies on the Israeli side. I think Netanyahu is the strong side. He should take the initiative, and we should move forward. I say it very clearly. But the question I put to you is, can we force him to move? Because Dubi is right when he describes the whole process, and Netanyahu is smart enough not to do a move that he loses his office, because if, he doesn't appreciate a great plan if the following day he's not the prime minister. I fully agree with this. I don't know how many of you remember Yitzhak Shamir. As you probably guess, I live in a kibbutz. I live in a kibbutz on the Lebanese border, so if I come from a kibbutz, I probably did not vote Shamir. But
You were too young then. This is the reason.
But I must say, I disagree with his views, but I greatly appreciated him because I truly thought that he serves the state of Israel the way he believes in. Let me tell you something. Netanyahu is not Shamir. It does not come from that strong ideology and belief. Netanyahu is a great manipulator, and he can be manipulated. And if you ask me, Dubi, can we bring Netanyahu to move forward? My answer is yes. Best would be if we could have another government. But if we can't, we still can. How? And I know 7 is coming and I'll be done by time. We need to work a deal that all 3 partners see it as a win-win. So from the Palestinian side, it would be relatively easy for Abu Mazen, instead of achieving 6 months of freezing of construction that does really nothing to the Palestinian people, if he could come back to give a speech to his people and say, guys, we've agreed in Washington, Netanyahu, Obama, and myself, or whoever the leaders be, that in the next 2-3 years, all the settlements east of the barrier are going to be evacuated. This is not final status, this is not the border. We did not agree for the border. But this is going to happen in the next 3 years. I think it's a great achievement. People would love it. On the US side, they would support it. How you move Netanyahu? Well, there are 2 ways. One that I'm not supporting, but it's a possible way, is to pressure him. I tried to convince, unsuccessfully, the US administration not to pressure the parties. This is what Obama has been doing over the last couple of years. He pressured them, he forced a meeting, they come, they meet, they shake hands, there is a photo op and nothing follows. I would encourage them not to pressure them, but to incentivize them. And this is a very different approach. If Netanyahu would know that he will get from the US, and I can give you the list, the following things, would he move? Now, it doesn't have to be only on the Israeli-Palestinian balance. He can get, for example, something like the letter of April 14, but I would not limit myself to the Israeli-Palestinian. Can Netanyahu be happy if he gets something on the Iranian issue? Can he be happy if he gets whatever, F-35 or whatever? Would Netanyahu love to be remembered in Israel history as the one who turned this country to be Singapore? Can we change all the infrastructure and job and education and whatever in Israel? So if you ask me, can we bring Netanyahu to the point that he says, I love it. I will be the one that did all this good to the Israeli people. I'm prepared to move on. If you ask me, can we do that? Yes.
In this 21st century Zoom era, I just have to ask Rob if he wants to say something despite what I just said, because you, after all, are not actually here. Although it seems like it.
Incentivizing people not to come to Los Angeles, but I'll take advantage of the opportunity. In 2008, I went to Jerusalem to head the Quartet mission, and in 2009, Prime Minister, then Mr. Netanyahu became Prime Minister, I spent a good deal of time then engaged with then former Prime Minister Tony Blair, who was the Quartet representative. And I would say we, in the subsequent 7 years, tried to do exactly what Eval suggested. But obviously, Eval is more tenacious than I am. I have actually despaired of the possibility of doing what he suggested. But I think that one thing that is clear to me, sitting in Washington and having spent those subsequent 2 years on the ground, is, and one thing we've now learned the hard way from the United States, is we cannot force the parties to make peace. I think what the disengagement showed, and what all peace efforts in that part of the world have showed, that is, if we have parties who want to do something big, we can help, and we can help facilitate it.
Just for you.
We can help facilitate their vision, be it Sadat going to Jerusalem, be it Sharon wanting to leave Gaza, be it Arafat and Rabin wanting to make peace between themselves, to make at least mutual recognition. But what we've seen over the last few years is that if the parties themselves are not motivated to and do not have a vision of the way forward, we can't